transfer Jennifer now to the stage. Here, here.
Just a disclaimer, if I seem like I'm gasping for air, that's just asthma, I'm not dying. Mr. Speaker, we believe that companies that create innovative technologies are important and we celebrate it. But this debate has to be about the evaluation of the economic and social costs that these disruptive companies bring to countries, as well as real-world costs that comes with their disruption. In that regard, we say that companies ought to be morally responsible and must take up the responsibility of compensating these industries as well. So what are these innovations that we are talking about? Many different things, Mr. Speaker. Things like Tesla utilizing electric energy and displacing cars as well as energy production in countries. Things like Google and Gmail displacing snail mail even, or things like cotton picking and utilizing mechanization to disrupt individuals being able to utilize their jobs. Firstly, we say that compensation can come in many different ways. Things like paying off individuals who are displaced, or even offering jobs to states where they prioritize manufacturing particular industries, like for example in Detroit, where an entire industry of manufacturing was displaced by Tesla. In that regard, we'll go to the extent of building factories in those particular areas where we allow for individuals to get jobs. But secondly, let's evaluate the actual disruptive value versus the perceived disruptive value. We think that companies more often than not don't become successful overnight. We think that this is a gradual process, the way in which they disrupt industries within a particular area. We think liability can be calculated on a gradual process. I think governments can evaluate this as opposed to assessing a lump sum payout. But firstly, let's establish the obligation that they have. Firstly, we argue when you're talking about moral responsibility that disruptive technologies only occur or only exist with the help of society. Firstly, the ability to set up your companies in particular countries means that in some instances, you get subsidies from the state to build up companies in that area. For example, wind farm in the Netherlands get subsidy from the state to build up green technologies in that area because the state believes that the technological innovation that you provide is a state interest. However, we think that no other individual or no other actor can take up the burden for two things. Number one, that state can't perceive the future of technological advancements, as well as state not having the ability to control technological advancement. In this regard, we think that these companies who directly profiteer off of loss of jobs within particular industries have to be responsible, Mr. Speaker. All the demands for cars and energy already exist before Tesla. We think that these demands were created from prior industrial pioneers, companies like GM or Chrysler. What these industry disruptors do is that they provide either cheaper or faster technology. In this regard, we say that they directly profit from the immediate loss that these industries have in regards with their jobs. But lastly, we say it is a principle that we already practice in status quo. When a company decides to retrench individual workers, or when a company decides to let you go, to downsize a particular company, they have to give you a severance package, because in status quo we acknowledge when a company or an entity displaces you, it needs to compensate individual that is taking space from, Mr. Speaker. But secondly, why is it good? Because we think it creates an increased acceptance to technological innovation and technological advancements. Firstly, we say that more often than not, the massive amount of opposition that people have with green technology is that people more often than not lose their jobs because green technology is more efficient. This is a rhetoric that the energy company utilizes all the time to galvanize individuals against green technology. Companies like BP utilize this and say that if you opt for green technology, you will lose your jobs and we can do nothing about it. But we think that when you compensate individual industries, more often than not, you dilute this rhetoric and allow individuals the ability to have an amiable environment to accept green technology and innovation. Several things happen as a consequence. Firstly, we say outdated industries are unable to galvanize people to reject technological advancement anymore, because you take away the political ammunition away from these companies against individuals within society, and being able to utilize a rhetoric that says that technological advancement isn't something that is a net good for you. But secondly, we argue that people become a lot more comfortable in accepting green technology and innovation once they see that companies want to create an environment that is a compromise that lets you have the ability to access technology that is good for you, whilst at the same time caring about individual workers who may be displaced by these industries. Because let's recognize, these are not small companies. If you're a company that is able to displace an entire or a substantial amount of industry, you are by far a large company, Mr. Speaker. The conclusion to this particular argument is that the reason why we need technological advancement to be accepted within society is because it's a good for society, right? When you have things like efficient management of resource, or efficient management of food, or the ability for us to create a technological advancement that affects a larger generation of individuals. Things like green technology that is more accessible to individuals by not having to pay a higher amount of value for things like coal or petroleum, Mr. Speaker. We think it is a moral imperative of the company to create an amiable environment for individuals to be able to accept this. But let's say we live in the world under side negative. Number one, either no one chooses to compensate states, or B, where governments only have to compensate this particular individual. Firstly, we argue that it's bad for the industry and it's bad for the country as well. Because if you recognize, when individuals lose jobs en masse and not being able to access economic structures that allows for them to access your technology to begin with, this means it is far less likely individuals will be receptive to the kind of technology that you want to bring in that particular regard. When your economies goes to hell and individuals are unable to pay things like income tax or just normal tax, for example, because they lose ability to access economic structure because their specialty was the particular industry that you displaced to begin with, this makes it far less likely for individuals to be able to access your technology to begin with. When you're a technological company, you want people to be able to buy or be able to access your products. But if people can't buy in, or if people can't access simply because they don't have the capital to access, or they don't have the ability to access the framework of financial structures in society, though your innovation may be good, but if people can't access, then we don't see the benefit of companies creating in that particular regard. We recognize that you may be profiteering from other states, therefore you don't see a disadvantage in not participating in another particular state. But when we're talking about states that rely on specific industries, like Detroit, where people lost their job en masse when you started seeing construction of industries via electric cars under Tesla, when individuals become displaced in that regard, we think it's important to note that you have to take upon the responsibility of providing individuals within this particular state some kind of compensation because you took up a position against them, Mr. Speaker. We recognize that a particular state that needs this compensation a lot more than another. But lastly, when you're a state and you can't control particular actions of private actors, it becomes an uncontrollable liability that you cannot be responsible upon. When you're talking about private entities being able to make decisions on their own, being able to make decisions as to how many jobs are we willing to displace in this particular industry, or how many factories are we willing to build in this particular areas, Mr. Speaker. The comparison here is this: when states are able to utilize legislation to enforce companies to pay compensation, at the very least they have some liability that they control in terms of how much displacement are we willing to take in a particular state, or how many workers are we willing to let go in comparison to getting technology that is great for a particular country. As a consequence, if governments cannot control this liability and only private entities have the ability to have the last say about the economic structures within your particular area, we think it is far more likely that governments will now start clamping down on institutions that want to bring in innovations within a particular country, Mr. Speaker. We think that in this regard, states becomes more exclusive in the use of outdated industries, Mr. Speaker, and not relying on technology that could be a greater good, because state does not see the trade-off in making the decision of allowing factories to exist in that particular area, as well as their individual voters losing a voice in that regard. Mr. Speaker, for all of Asia, I am proud to open this debate.
I would like to thank Jay for a first approach and now talk about add the program he or they to the stage to begin the case of side negative.
Mr. Speaker, when states subsidize industries, it's because they view them as being desirable to the collective that they represent. And when it does so, and chooses to impose the cost of that development, technological change and disruption, upon a particular industry and the workers within it, on behalf of that collective, it should also charge that collective as taxpayers to fund their support of those workers in the form of welfare, transfer payments and job programs, as we see happen in most welfare states. But even when the state doesn't subsidise it, we think that disruptive industries often are disruptive because they're popular. And we think that when they're popular, it's because the collective has endorsed that as a progress in capitalist society that they were prepared to entertain. The cost of that progress, of falling on certain individuals, is something that the regulatory control of the government should properly retain the responsibility for. I'm reading three things in this speech. Firstly, why we don't think corporate actors are the best placed morally to have this particular obligation foisted upon them. Secondly, why this harms and sets back innovation in a way that's particularly disadvantageous to vulnerable workers. And thirdly, why this is the worst possible mechanism by which we can seek to compensate the vicissitudes of late capitalism. Firstly, why is there no obligation? Any employee faces the risk that the individual skills that they've opted to invest in themselves will no longer be marketable at some point in their career. If you were an engineering student in Australia at the height of the mining boom, and after commodity prices fall, you can't find a job, that's not the fault of the companies that are no longer buying coal, or the fault of the industries that are no longer employing you. It's no one's fault. The fault is that of the collective society that sees capitalism as being the choices of mutual agents working to their own individual best interests as a way of advancing the collective good. And that's why we think there's a social safety net, a collective pact between society that says that when you fall down on your luck, we will look after you, because it's us who benefits from your labour and from the investment that you make into your own human capital. The primary obligation of companies, however, should be first and foremost to their own current employees, the ones that they've contracted to, the ones that they benefit from the labour with, and not different employees in different industries whose when their technology may have had an impact on them that they may or may not have foreseen, because it detracts from their ability to pay and look after their own investors, shareholders, employees, and the conditions that they can afford then. And we say that that's incredibly important because those employment conditions are things that all parties have consented to. And we'd analogize this to like banks in the financial crisis, right? Lehman Brothers probably has a pretty serious moral obligation to the people who have given money to Lehman Brothers, but it doesn't necessarily have an obligation 5 rungs down the track to a company that fails because it can't get investment or credit from a retail bank that's been affected by the broader caution that's existed in that society. Imposing that kind of indefinite liability makes all corporations too cautious in the way they pursue their own self-interest and the interest of the people they've agreed to assist. But the second thing that we'd say here is that there's very often very little malicious intent in the way these corporations pursue progress. It's often an incidental consequence of the changes in technologies that they pursue. And it's difficult to assess their actual responsibility in the falling of other industries. For instance, when Amazon makes books incredibly cheap, multiple retail stores for books in Australia went out of business. Now, we can attribute part of that responsibility to Amazon, but it's very difficult for a government or a court to attribute the full responsibility of that to Amazon when the government at the same time was applying GST to on-the-ground sales and not online sales, when the government had policies like parallel importation rules that meant that books had to be made in Australia at a higher cost to the consumer. We think that industries fail for a multiplicity of reasons. Disruptive technology is only one of them. But the final thing that we say here is that workers in other industries protect themselves and have the capacity to. And we talk about like Uber and the taxi industry using its massively unionized power to lobby against the presence of that organization, to fight for regulatory change against that organization, and the success that they've had in doing so in making Uber employees be found to be employees that are guaranteed standards in the same way that they are, imposing a higher cost on that business and making it less competitive. We think that that's the appropriate way for workers to exercise their power themselves, not presuming and asserting that the government can impose a cost upon a different corporation. But secondly, why does this harm innovation? And we think it's crucial. Innovation in capitalist society is crucial to unlocking lives that are less nasty and brutish and short. And the model that they set up of one of ongoing liability that will be assessed indefinitely into the future by governments is going to have the effect of effectively bankrupting disruptive innovation at the point that occurs. Because sometimes it's really large and well-paid workforces that they're displacing, like the car industry in Detroit, Mr. Speaker, which we don't think Tesla has the ability to pay off in terms of their future ongoing salaries in the same way that the US government does. But it's also important when we talk about startups being disruptive, because not all disruptive technology comes from the monopolies that they wanted to talk about, Mr. Speaker. It often comes from small nascent firms that have a particularly good idea and a highly skilled workforce that's able to bring it to market. And those firms are often negative in terms of their cash flow for the first 5 to 10 years. Imposing this additional liability means they're going to be frozen out of the investment resources that they otherwise would have been given. It's unlikely that it will ever see the light of day. Let's do some rebuttal battle here. Because they told us it's going to be easier for these technologies to get off the ground. They gave us the example of green tech being, more competitive and less likely to be lobbied against. Number one, the comparative here is the impossibility of the real financial incentives and limitations that I just talked about. But we also don't accept their analysis that people will just stop lobbying now that they're compensated, because the size of that compensation package is likely to be significantly less over time than the massive amounts of money that they would have gained if they'd kept their jobs. But the second reason they gave us that this would be better is because corporations will benefit from the positive PR of giving back to other workers, right? If that is true, then rational economic actors, the rational economic actors that are companies, would probably be engaging in that type of behavior currently to get that kind of PR benefit. We think it's likely that that PR benefit is substantially outweighed by the indefinite liability that you're imposing upon them. But what are the harms of this? Because it's not just society that loses out from having things like clean technology and new enterprise and new economic possibilities, it's vulnerable people themselves. Because when capital displaces labour, it enables mass production and economies of scale that make products cheaper. And that means that if you are a vulnerable worker in a capitalist economy, you're able to afford more stuff to make your life slightly better. And we point to the example of tomato harvesting in the 70s, or even the example they gave us of cotton picking and cotton harvesting, that massively made it cheaper to have food and have clothes on your back. And if you're a vulnerable worker within these industries and these technologies, it's incredibly important you're able to access those things. But we secondly say it makes the lives of the collective better, because like solar power and green technology is better than coal, and we don't want to hamper that development when it's already at a cost disadvantage. But the final thing here is that it changes the nature of available jobs, away from things like picking cotton and into other industries that governments can support retraining for, jobs programs for, which they'll always have a political incentive to do. That's going to bring me to my final point. Because we think that it's going to be very easy for corporations to skirt around their obligations to other workers. They'll either claim that they're not disruptive, they're entirely new industries, or they'll say that they weren't causally responsible for that problem and fight in court and fight against the government to minimise the amount that they have to pay people. We think the government is a far better provider of the types of support that these people need. Number one, because they preference retraining programs in industries that they know that the economy is going to need, rather than the cash benefits and cash handouts that these guys are likely to get. But secondly, because the political incentives are better. Because at a local level, they know that it's likely to disrupt an industry in a way that affects their ability to hang on to power. That means they'll always have the incentive to be generous in the way that they pay out these payments. This is a policy that insulates the government from those types of pressures to provide those policies that we think are far superior and we think are where the moral responsibility for this type of compensation ought lie. For all those reasons, we oppose.
I'd like to thank Ed for his speech, and I'll call upon the second and first speaker, Steve Sal of Global Project Programs.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the world gets more and more technologically advanced, nice words like retraining become more and more meaningless in a modern society, ladies and gentlemen. Because it's easy for a negative in this debate to throw out the words, add more tax, let's retrain them, without acknowledging the kind of skill level that's required for you to actually engage in technologies such as, I don't know, electric cars, or things, for example, that are increased mechanization in status quo, ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, as much as we would like the state as a society to bear the brunt of the burden that we're talking about, Jane gave you multiple levels of analysis how the state could never perceive what kind of technological advancements could ever be perceived in the future. The fact that they can't control the influx or the outflow of technological advancement, and they cannot calculate the cost for themselves, ladies and gentlemen, which make them distinctly unable to be the one actor that could protect individuals in society. Unfortunately, the negative in this debate was unfortunately uncomparative. The first thing I want to talk about is the welfare state that the negative wanted to rely on so much. They said that let's just raise taxes and transfer the cost onto society, not acknowledging that that argument feeds right into the argument that Jay talked about, that the government has a perverse incentive to clamp down on these particular industry because of the political incentives in which force governments to clamp down on new industries or innovative industries that conventionally would have displaced individuals in society. They don't acknowledge the fact that most of the time lobby groups and the ones that they are talking about are significantly stronger when they can play upon the rhetoric that you are going to lose your jobs, and they can lobby those very very same governments do not raise the taxes because they don't want to pay the brunt of those particular individuals. In a situation where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, ladies and gentlemen, where you're stuck between raising taxes, which is impracticable and people don't want it, and a situation where you have to force companies to pay it, when this company is obviously disruptive, obviously successful, and making millions out of displacing a new industry, we would rather transfer the cost towards the actor that can actually perform the task that you're talking about under our side of the house, ladies and gentlemen. We would rather side with that. The second thing they talked about is that these industries are oftentimes popular because societies are buying these things and therefore they don't need additional help or forcing these people onto them. But unfortunately, societies aren't homogeneous in nature, or economies aren't homogeneous in nature. While in Washington and Texas you might have different sorts of industries, sometimes you have communities that are directly concentrated in the kind of industries that they are performing. This means think industries like Detroit, which are wholly surrounded things like car manufacturing with Daimler Chrysler and things like that. That means in a situation where you cause a total population to lose their jobs or to displace their particular industry, you force entire communities into economic depression, ladies and gentlemen. And this isn't something that, like for example, another community or another state can pick up the bill for and then suddenly retrain these individuals. We've often seen that a singular state going into economic depression can pull down entire national GDPs or national economies because it has rippling effects into, for example, how the international community views your entire country. Because one state fails, that means your entire country becomes an unviable investment scheme, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that that's exceptionally important when you acknowledge that states cannot pick up the bill immediately under those circumstances. So in those circumstances, who can pick up the bill? Which is a practical solution in this particular regard. We're not placing requirements on these individuals because it's fun, because we're vindictive, or because we just want to place requirements onto individuals, ladies and gentlemen. We think there is a dire requirement to place a restriction onto individuals that can actually displace entire economies, ladies and gentlemen, in a practical fashion and not an idealistic fashion like a welfare state. I'm done with that rebuttal. The third thing I want to talk about is that oftentimes the moral obligation is transferred towards your own employers, right? Because not some person five times down the run, apparently, as Ed says. But, ladies and gentlemen, we are able to calculate liability as well as the connection of you displacing economy to a very accurate extent in many circumstances. If we can determine in many civil suits how to determine monopolies in economies, ladies and gentlemen, for example, we can determine in some vague economic terms, I'm an econ student, don't ask me, but if Google or AOL is monopolizing a particular economy, ladies and gentlemen, we are able to actively and accurately ascertain whether or not these companies are displacing many other companies. Maybe calculated by number of jobs lost, or whether they are directly competing industries or not, ladies and gentlemen. We think that's fairly simple to do. But what they told us under that side of the house, for the second thing, is that they told us that many of these new companies will be victimized, apparently, because they're starting up. But we think that it's fairly uncomparative to the proposal, ladies and gentlemen. Because I'm fairly sure that if you're a new company, you're not that disruptive. Because I'm very sure that if I start up a company now and just call it a green tech company, I'm fairly sure that I'm not going to be able to have lots and lots of liability because I'm not displacing much jobs or catch the attention of the judiciary, ladies and gentlemen. But what we are, that means there a fairly sufficient amount of time and buffer zone, ladies and gentlemen, in order to grow and in order to have the ability to expand their processes and expand their controlling mechanism in order to produce more things or innovate more, ladies and gentlemen. But also, we told you, right from Jay's speech, and here's why I'm adding more material, is that we already told you that this allows companies to be able to control the amount of innovation that they have. Sure, the government takes the position of calculating costs, but the innovator takes the role of controlling how much output they have into the particular economy, ladies and gentlemen. So for example, if I think to myself, and I'm acting as a responsible corporate actor, that I'm going to displace X number of jobs in society, then maybe I will hold off my production or my innovation within 3 years or 4 years, ladies and gentlemen. We recognize that this may create some delay in the technological innovations that you want, but it's sustainable and responsible delay under our side of the house. But what you have comparatively under your side of the house is either one of two things. It's either number one, you have a wholesale innovation to displace entire economies irresponsibly, which creates economic depression under their side of the house, or the second scenario is that you have limitations by governments or restrictions by governments that make people less comfortable in accepting those technological innovations, ladies and gentlemen. We need a sustainable way in order to encourage innovation. The last thing I want to talk about is about politics and lobbying. Because fundamentally, the first half of my speech already proved to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the alternatives provided by the affirmative in this debate were impracticable, and we needed a sustainable way in order to achieve change, and that was provided by the affirmative. But the second thing I want to talk about is the receptiveness of the technology. I'm going to extend the analysis further. They told us that if it was really that beneficial in order for me to act in a certain way, that it's innovative companies, then rational economic actors, whatever that means in society, will be able to work out that way, ladies and gentlemen. But unfortunately, most actors are not rational or not considerate in terms of how they act within the economy. Of course, if a green technology feels they can wholesale displace the oil company, they have an active incentive to do that. They don't need to take care or take notice of people who are not working with them, take notice of people who won't contribute to their profits, ladies and gentlemen. They don't have the economic incentive to take into consideration social responsibility concerns, and that's why governments always impose corporate social responsibility limitations onto companies. For example, carbon limits. For example, many limits that we have in terms of drilling or regulations in terms of that. Because if not, companies would never do that on their own, ladies and gentlemen. The last thing I want to talk about is about, in terms of politics and lobbying, ladies and gentlemen, is that we can't stop the lobbying that happens when it comes to politics in society against technological advancements if we can't take away the lobby's fundamental ability to influence politicians when politicians are fundamentally driven by what voters want. When voters are outraged because they just lost jobs, you are more likely than not to never achieve the change you want, never achieve the advancement that you want. Ladies and gentlemen, this is about sustainable development, and you will only find that in the affirmative team. Thank you.
I'd like to thank myself for the second affirmative speech, and now call upon the second negative speaker to the stage. All this, the shall pronounce he or they.
The process of introducing a new technology in the status quo is admittedly a tricky one. Perhaps governments will resist it slightly in the short term, but as voters increasingly become environmentally aware and governments realize they can't oppose it forever because they have to compete with other governments, those regulations are lifted. Innovation is allowed into society. The same goes for existing corporations, who under both models are going to argue for that new innovation to be to not be allowed to happen. The difference is, as soon as you place the cost of paying out every single worker on someone like Uber, who started massively with negative capital from risk-averse investors, or someone like Amazon, who has brought down prices for hundreds of millions of people, they can't take that on, and they shouldn't have to. That's the comparison in this debate, because it wasn't a case of a technology being slowly introduced and maybe it would be introduced 3 or 4 years later. At the end of the day, the cost to that company would be the same. And if it couldn't afford them, that innovation wouldn't happen. First thing I want to talk about is why are innovators not to be punished? Seems like a really dangerous line of argumentation to me to say that if I do something that is good for me, that accidentally or as a subsidiary hurts your ability to succeed, then I automatically have to cover it. If this team debates exceptionally well and puts us out of the break, for some reason they have to compensate us for that, right? Just because they were pursuing their self-interest as were we. That's the real relationship in this debate. It's between, in the context of a society that continues to encourage innovation and implicitly puts in norms that say that's the end game for you, to then punish you for that for the subsidiary harms of disruption is a bad one. The second thing we told you is that all individuals assume risk when they lose jobs. Why was it in, for instance, Detroit, where a car industry was always going to die because it was shitty and not competitive, were those people more deserving of a payout from that corporation than the hundreds of other people that faced unemployment from a bunch of different factors that governments could also not control? So it's a weird line of argumentation to be like, because governments can't possibly, predict innovation, therefore we should outsource it to someone that could potentially introduce that technology. Firstly, governments in a lot of cases could predict. As they said, governments are the ones that put in measures to deal with new innovation by slowly providing compensation to their citizens in the form of welfare. But also, why did it matter that governments couldn't predict innovation? Why did that mean that the responsibility had to go elsewhere? Maybe they couldn't, but all that meant was, as a society, as a collective, we had a responsibility to provide a welfare base for everyone that lost their job, regardless of why that reason was. That's why we said that since all citizens benefit from this sort of technology, since implicitly they make decisions to support it, to buy it, they should be the ones to pay it. That's why we think it's an unfair policy to put in place, and certainly one that's inconsistent with other types of relationships we'd have. It's not one country's responsibility to pay the welfare of other countries' citizens because some decision that they made may have affected the jobs of an overseas state, or one person's responsibility to help out someone else because a decision that they made down the line, like, you know, holding up a train door makes someone else late for work. Doesn't mean you owe a responsibility to that person to be like, you missed out on a promotion, here's your promotion package. Like, this is a ridiculous moral obligation to place on companies. But what makes it far scarier is that it's one that would have killed Uber and my cheap fares home when I'm really drunk. It would have killed Amazon and the books that I pretend to read, you know, in the university holidays, and it would have killed tomato growth and agricultural development in the US that continues to feed people and clothe people. Why does this lead to lower amounts of innovation? Big glaring case in their problem is they didn't answer who are the companies that are likely to be innovating and who are the companies that are likely to be benefiting. We told you these guys are like only big companies can disrupt, as if Uber was this massive conglomerate before it started. No, this is how it works, Mr. Speaker. It attracts capital by going into negative debt and convincing investors that they have a good case to make money. The difference is now investors, who are already risk averse, have the possibility of paying a vague payout to every single person that is hit with a job loss, that's decided in court, that's decided really weirdly. And it means that those companies that have high amounts of leveraging, and I am an economics student, by the way, guys, means that these companies are likely to be massively harmed. We also told you that's true because disruptive technologies are likely to be the ones that are displacing labour, that are the ones creating a lost job. The point I want to make here is that means that firms who are mostly small are not able to develop that product. What's the alternative? My substantive, which is this creates monopolization of markets, because the alternative of small firms not being able to disrupt existing markets is if it's true and only big firms are the ones creating disruptive technology, then those big firms can do a couple of things. A, they can either launch that technology and entrench power within that industry, or B, they can sit on that technology and make it less likely that that technology comes out. That's especially true when patents are involved, and the reason that's more likely under their model is because people that create technology and innovate have no alternative. They can't sell to anyone else because small investors are not capable of taking that risk on. They're not capable of taking that harm on. That means that this entrenches existing power within certain industries and makes A, prices higher, and B, labour standards lower because there aren't alternative industries offering those same workers jobs. Then what did they tell us in response? The problem they wanted to solve was this. That consumers didn't want this technology to be part of it, and we needed to convince them. But at the point where your technology is disruptive, consumers have shown support for that product. Consumers are taking Uber. Consumers are buying books from Amazon at the point where it becomes a disruptive technology. That's not the problem. What was the problem on their side? Governments are scared of disruption in the status quo, and they'll clamp down on innovation, and that's a problem. To some degree, Mr. Speaker, governments can't resist that change forever, and they have the capacity to pay out as the change happens. They have to compete with other nations who are likely to get ahead of them when they embrace that disruptive technology. They have to deal with a workforce that broadly at the moment supports the idea of that disruptive innovation. What was their other problem? Established industries can no longer use scare tactics to make people, not do it. But you'd still lobby for change as a coal mining industry or as a taxi mobile industry, and they have. And the reason that's important is they have that capacity, The disruptive technology should have the capacity to launch. And it's still very easy for someone to be like, I have a vague prospect of getting some number of compensation through the court system, but I don't want to lose my job, and still be quite risk averse in resisting it. So that analysis works on both sides of the case. The result of that is small companies, the majority of disruptive technologies, can't innovate, and we're left with a system that has higher prices and technology that isn't able to help people. Final question in this debate is what happens to those that are left unemployed? Because let's be very clear, as sad as it is, that employment changes, it moves to other industries. And reskilling wasn't just a word, it was an ability for governments to provide and locate money in a certain way. What this policy does is it means that governments are less likely to pump money into that area because it sets a norm of corporations being responsible, and it's easy at the moment for people to point to homelessness or point to job loss and say, you have to fix that as the government. This makes it less likely governments will do that. But the decision is this. If you give people, even if their case works, if you give people a handout versus governments allocating that money, governments are best able to predict where the economy will go in future and therefore can allocate money to where those skills are likely to be utilised and where the jobs are likely to be. We're incredibly bad at doing that as individuals, so our policy is the one that gets people back into a job more quickly as well. Innovation to some degree is inherent, it's going to happen. Ours makes it happen faster, it makes it happen more effectively, and it doesn't force governments to leave people out in the cold.
I'd like to thank the second negative speaker for the speech, and I'll call upon the third affirmative speaker, Jasmine, with no professional analysis.
It was very odd that the principle they tried to draw in this debate was to make a parallel to an individual. They say that if an individual is a successful individual, he shouldn't be responsible to every other person he affects. The difference is a corporation is not an individual. An action a corporation does affect millions and millions of people, affect multiple levels of jobs, and affect a lot of people as well as affect the economy and an entire industry. So we're very happy inside government to impose a higher standard of morality as well as a higher standard of responsibility on actors that are particularly responsible for the lives of a lot of people. That's why we say that the degree of responsibility of a government differs largely from the degree of responsibility from a common human being. So the same way a corporate responsibility is so much more significant than the responsibility of an individual. So realize that we said that from first speaker that the amount of jobs that you lose are huge and that the government could not possibly compensate all these individuals. In that situation, we're very happy